Hi, I'm Richard Dolan. Thanks for being here with me. I'm here to talk with you about UFOs, but first I want to talk about something a little different, or something related, actually, truth and lies. And it's because I feel that we're at a point in our history where millions of people fully understand that they have been lied to by their established authorities over and over again. And not just over little things like examples of individual corruption or deceit, although that, of course, has always been with us for as long as we've lived in societies. But no, I'm talking about the unsettling realization that in some fundamental way, things are very, very wrong. It's not that there is just injustice, it's that we're being lied to every day by the so-called authorities that we're told we're supposed to trust in order to be informed citizens. We've been had. And that's the case. That's true. Today, the responsible authorities who, in just the last few years, have taken giant leaps toward curating, as they like to call it, our reality. Organizations like Google, which own YouTube or Facebook or Instagram or Amazon. This is a new version of book burning and airbrushing history that's going on right now. It involves a full court press against anything that it considers alternative. Right. Because alternative narratives are under assault every day now. I research UFOs. If you do as well, and if you're like me, you have been waiting, just waiting for that hammer to fall on the field of ufology. Well, it's already been coming down. And it's been coming down in the form of soft censorship, soft deplatforming, skewed search engine results, and the like. The corporate and political establishment have already made important gains in this, and they're not going to stop on their own. I'll be returning to this theme. You can bet on it. But I'm here to tell you that control over the narratives that govern your reality has been going on for a very long time, for your entire life. In fact, before there was digital media and social media, there was always the corporate and political establishment, which has had preponderant influence over, and at times I would say even direct control over what we call the media, that is news and entertainment. For those of you who like to fight the power, so to speak, but think of UFOs as somewhat or somehow irrelevant or silly or mistaken or anything of this sort, well, let me just offer you a different perspective. I want to take you back to 1952. I do, after all, like to study the history of this subject. Back in the 1950s, of course, we had an interesting situation of privately owned media, newspapers and radio mostly, that were in the process of being covertly and quietly absorbed by the established powers. Creeping corporate consolidation was one part of this assault on an independent media, and things like Operation Mockingbird were another prong in the attack. That was the political part of it. And I've discussed this before, but for now, I'm simply going to point out that this control, this deception, this pattern of lying has always been with us. It's simply taking on new forms today. Anyway, it's important to keep talking about the true history of UFOs. It's not a sure thing that we will always be able to do so as easily as we used to think, as easily as I used to think. No. UFOs are censored, UFOs are alternative, precisely because they are important, because they are probably the single most important unacknowledged subterranean element of our history. One example is in my topic for today, the 1952 overflights of multiple UFOs over the capital of the United States for several weekends in a row. And this, of course, is part of my discussion of the Project Blue Book series featured on the History Channel. It's my final installment of covering this series since their first season ended a few weeks ago, and this was their final episode. And it's not been my intention to offer a critique of the series like a movie critic would do. I'm not much of a movie critic, I guess, but I do find the history fascinating and this series of events very much so. So let me begin. I'm going to share a couple of screens with you, and we'll get going on this. The significance of UFOs over the Capitol is multifold. All right. First, you have UFOs being reported over the Capitol of the United States in July of 1952 for 2 weekends in a row. It was covered in detail by the mainstream media. It was the scene of, you could see here, a radar operator at Washington National Airport. It received the attention of mainstream media, the attention of the United States president, and was this prompted the press conference, which was a series of lies, really, to cover the whole thing up. And it's also significant because the classified world didn't really believe the excuses, frankly, that were offered up. So all of that is a few reasons why the events of 1952 of that summer were very, very significant. So, yeah, we're talking about, incredible confrontations with these objects, which, in fact, according to people like Edward Ruppelt, who was on the spot, seemed like an invasion was underway in the context of extreme arguments and discussions going on within the military over what to do about all of this. All of this was happening in 1952. And in fact, the events over the Capitol in July and subsequent events, many of which have been kind of forgotten by history, but all of these intense moments in the history of UFOs led directly to what we call the Robertson panel and the clamp down of UFO information within the classified world. And that was January of 1953. So yeah, you were lied to. Just like the great event at Roswell and countless events that had taken place since 1947, this series of events in 1952 was similarly squashed by the political and media establishment. You were lied to, and you were lied to even if you weren't born yet. You were lied to because these lies continue to pervade our lives like poison in our blood. And we need to get that poison out. And the only way of doing it is by learning alternatives to the established official authorities. All right, so what happened? Let me give you a little bit of a context. Before 1952, there is a kind of slow, quiet, very quiet buildup of the UFO drama, we could say, within the national security apparatus. There were always sightings, very dramatic ones, in 1947, 48, 49, 50, 51. They never went away, but they were, generally speaking, contained as far as the public was concerned. Several certainly seeped out. We did have a kind of semblance of a free press back then. There were still a number of independently owned newspapers and media outlets, and they did cover this phenomenon to the extent that they could. There were wire services increasingly that were managed, controlled, influenced by national security. That's all true, but there was enough that came out. But from the point of view of public management, at least, the project seemed to be somewhat under control. That is the secrecy project of UFOs. Edward Ruppelt, captain in the Air Force, was brought to Air Technical Intelligence Center. That's where Project Blue Book would soon be operated. He was brought there in the summer of 1951. He was put in charge of its predecessor, what was called Project Grudge. Starting early 1952, we began to see a crescendo in UFO sightings, and they began very noticeably to increase. In April, the newly renamed Grudge became Blue Book, was newly renamed into Blue Book. And in April of 1952, they received 99 reports, which was for them a very busy month. A lot of these were baffling, but many interesting reports never made it to Blue Book. And one came from Donald Kehoe. I really want to mention this case. This is in the buildup to 1952 summer, where things really got out of control. There's Kehoe. One website referred to Donald Kehoe as the OG ufologist. And if you don't know what that means, that's original gangster or just original. And Donald Kehoe is absolutely that. Anyway, this is an interesting case that Kehoe got from one of his Navy connections relating to the Secretary of the Navy, that's Dan Kimball, and Admiral Arthur Radford. These are two of the highest ranking Navy people in 1952. You can see Radford, here's the cover of Time magazine. These are very important people. While flying to Hawaii from Southern California in separate planes, Kimball was out in front, about 50 miles in front. He sees two disc-shaped objects moving very fast. They estimated in the aircraft that this was at about 1,500 miles per hour. Whatever it was unbelievably fast. So this is Radford's plane here. They circled his plane twice. All right, these two objects then headed 50 miles east to the plane carrying Admiral Radford. And there's Radford again. They circled Radford's plane and zoomed up out of sight. Now, that's interesting enough. Clearly, you've got a situation where highly advanced unknown objects are able to act with total ease around aircraft carrying two of the most powerful and important men in the United States national security system at that time. But there's a follow-up that's actually really interesting, which was that Kimball, the Secretary of the Navy, could not get a single straight answer from the Air Force about what had happened. That was certainly annoying to him. He also learned that the Air Force was very aggressively demanding all copies of UFO reports from Navy and Marine Corps witnesses who had been seeing UFOs, even before preliminary Navy investigations had been made. So Kimball was rather annoyed by all this, and he decided, you know what, we're going to initiate our own naval intelligence reports on UFOs, totally independent from the Air Force's Project Blue Book. And he told the Office of Naval Research, ONR, to start a special investigation. This is a quote, to be kept separate from the Air Force project. And all of this came to Donald Kehoe's attention. He got this information from an old friend of his, an admiral in the Navy, Admiral Calvin Bolster. And here's a really nice picture of Bolster. He's classic, tough-looking guy who's running the U.S. military, or at least his part of it. Bolster was a friend of Kehoe's, and according to, and actually Kimball also spoke with Kehoe. He was able to get a brief audience with him, and they all confirmed this. But according to them, the Air Force got very upset at the news of a formal independent Navy body to investigate UFOs, and Naval Research eventually stopped its official investigation. Kimball never made his own sighting public, although he mentioned it to Kehoe, and that's kind of basically amounting to the same thing. Edward Ruppelt mentioned a very remarkable UFO sighting in May of 1952 in his book, Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. I've always considered this to be a very important event. We don't have a lot of information on it, but according to Ruppelt, this sighting was made by, quote, one of the top people in the CIA, while this person was giving a lawn party at his home near Alexandria, Virginia. Now, if you want to find out who the two top people in the CIA were at that time, these are them. This is Walter Beadle Smith, who was the director of the CIA at the time in 1952, and the deputy director of the CIA in 1952 was Allen Dulles, who, of course, within a year became the director of the CIA and arguably the most prominent director of the CIA we've ever had. Allen Dulles was a very powerful man. Both of them were. Now, I don't know if it was either of these two men who were giving the party, but what Ruppelt said, first of all, he described the object. He said it was a silent object performing a near vertical climb and then dove straight down, leveled off, and zoomed away. So that's what these people saw. And Ruppelt added, quote, a number of notable personages in attendance also saw it. They made some phone calls that night, and this is Ruppelt again. He says, the mention of their names on a telephone got quick results, end quote. So again, I don't know if it was Smith, I don't know if it was Dulles, but I will bet you anything that both of these men were definitely apprised of what happened. The news reached General John Alexander Samford, who was head of Air Force intelligence at the time. Samford, very, very important in what goes on later in 1952. And anyway, Ruppelt eventually was ordered to get down to Washington on the double. And he goes there to interview the host and to interview whatever he could learn, but they were not able to figure out what this object was. So very, very interesting. This is all in the lead up to what was about to happen. Then comes June 1952. UFO sightings were very, very prominent, very many of them. Ruppelt was getting them. Air Force intelligence was looking them over. All the branches of the military were dealing with this. And Ed Ruppelt describes in June a meeting in the office of John Samford, the general in charge of a lot of this. And there's Ruppelt and Samford together. As Ruppelt describes this in his book, Samford is there, his staff is there, Navy intelligence is there. A couple of captains from Navy intelligence were there. And much of Samford's staff were there. And Ruppelt talks about this meeting. And he has actually, there were some people I can't name who were also there, whatever that means. This was a tense and argumentative meeting. They're talking about UFOs. One of Samford's staff members, was a colonel, argues, he says, Blue Book's investigation was biased, and it was biased against the interplanetary extraterrestrial thesis. And Ruppelt writes, after this statement, quote, you could almost hear the colonel add, okay, so now I've said it, end quote. In other words, talking about the thing in the room that everyone knew about and no one wanted to discuss openly, the fact that we're dealing with a potentially extraterrestrial phenomenon. This is mentioned in Samford's office. An emotional debate, according to Ruppelt, continues. Nothing is accomplished. Ruppelt describes, as July comes, that there were two fundamental opinions that had coalesced within the Pentagon. One was that, well, they were all dead serious, he says, but one group said, wanted to start, as he says, from a policy of starting from the assumption that UFOs were interplanetary. And therefore wanted a clampdown on the release of all information. According to Ruppelt, this group thought that the security classification of the project should go to top secret. He said that their enthusiasm, quote, took a firm hold in the Pentagon and many other agencies, he said, throughout the government. And by the end of the month, this was the dominant group. They said this is interplanetary and we need to clamp down totally on information, as opposed to the group that didn't think it was interplanetary. In Ruppelt's opinion, this was the dominant group, according to his perspective. And keep in mind, he was a fairly low-level operative. He did not have access to the highest levels of secrecy, but even from his perspective, it was obvious what was going on. So, another interesting thing about this, Ruppelt may have gotten a heads up about the 2 weekends of events that took place over Washington, D.C. Actually, it could have been 3 weekends of events. I recently chatted with Frank Fascino, and we'll be airing that interview on Monday, all about the Flatwoods Monster incident and the lead up to it. And in Frank's judgment, there actually were 3 well-documented incidents that took place over Washington 3 weekends in a row. But what's interesting is whether Ruppelt got a heads up on this. So around the middle of July 1952, Ruppelt's talking. He had a 2-hour conversation, he said, with a scientist, he said, from an agency I can't name, about the buildup of UFO reports, particularly along the East Coast of the United States. Now, what agency could this be that he can't name it? Just to point out, the NSA did not yet exist in the summer of 1952. So are we talking about the CIA? Are we talking about MJ-12? It's worth thinking about. Anyway, this scientist says to Ruppelt, this is in the middle of July 1952, he says, you are sitting right on top of a big keg full of loaded flying saucers. It's an interesting way to put it. He predicted, he said, quote, within the next few days, they're going to blow up and you're going to have the granddaddy of all UFO sightings. According to Ruppelt, this man said the sightings will occur in Washington or New York, probably Washington. Now, wow. What was this man's agency? How did he get his information? Did these remarks mean that UFOs were a part of some secret military organization? Or that maybe he knew the alien agenda? Was it just a lucky guess? Ruppelt never answered these questions, and no one else really has, as far as I know. But it's very interesting to talk about this. And this is one of the things actually mentioned in the TV show that I'll just mention, where they sort of indicate that Alan Hynek was given advanced information about these sightings that were going to take place. Well, in fact, Hynek was given nothing of the sort, but Ruppelt was. Ruppelt was given this very suggestive hint. And if it does mean that these objects, which I'm about to describe here, were of our own manufacture, well, there's still a lot of explaining to be done here, because these objects had incredible capabilities. And according to some of the eyewitnesses, and I'm going to get into this in just a moment, they did not look like any ordinary craft whatsoever. So it's not an easy thing to answer this question. But let me get on to the 2 weekends in a row where we've got very good information here. First of all, D.C. had already been the scene of UFO activity. This was not a new thing. But what happened for the weekend of July 19th, 20th, and July 26th, 27th, this went far beyond anything up to that point. So the Washington sightings were probably among the most compelling and I would say dramatic UFO sightings in modern American history, and they are still unsolved. I don't care what anyone says on this. No one has solved this. It starts on July 19th, close to midnight, about 11:40 p.m. You have radar at Washington National Airport picking up. Let me show you a nice image here again of what's going on. A radar operator. This is a genuine photograph from July 19th, 20th. They're picking up a formation of 7 objects near Andrews Air Force Base. They're moving along slowly, 100, 130 miles per hour. Before long, 2 of the targets suddenly accelerate and vanish off the scope so fast, within seconds. Apparently, they were reaching a speed of multiple thousands of miles per hour. One estimate had them at about 7,000 miles per hour. So this got the attention of several controllers, especially when they learned that a second radar at the airport, as well as radar at Andrews Air Force Base, had also picked up these objects. And for 6 hours, between 8 and 10 UFOs were tracked on radar that night. This is a picture of the senior air traffic controller for the night. His name was Harry G. Barnes. Barnes later said he knew immediately that a very strange situation existed. And this is a quote from him. He said, the movements were completely radical compared to those of ordinary aircraft. They followed no set course and were not in any formation. And he said, we only seemed to be able to track them for about 3 miles at a time. He said, for 6 hours, there were at least 10 unidentifiable objects moving along Washington. They were not ordinary aircraft. I can safely deduce, Barnes said, that they performed gyrations which no known aircraft could perform. Another of the, here's a nice picture, by the way, of the control room from that night. And one of the men, in a radar image, tough to make that out here from a newspaper. This man was named Howard Coughlin. He was a towerman, and it's a nice picture of him. Shortly before he died, I was able personally to interview Howard Coughlin, and that is an interview we did from 2009, if you can believe it. Coughlin died early in 2010, a couple of months after this interview. And I just want to say this interview has really not gotten a lot of attention, and I'm going to try to, I have a brief, a couple of minute long video clip of it, which I think I should be able to get out there. But this is a direct quote from Coughlin. all these years later. We saw it on radar. People downstairs saw it on radar. We saw it out the window. We knew right away that it was not an aircraft. I can still visualize that shape as being something that you didn't normally see. It was round and curved on top. We just figured it was a UFO. So now, several times, at least 2 of the radar stations showed the same targets simultaneously, but this phenomenon wasn't restricted simply to radar tracking. I just want to point out there were several airline pilots. Capital Airline was an airline at the time. They had pilots who saw these objects visually. This is one of the pilots here, S.C. Pierman, as orange lights in the same area that radar indicated where they should be. And so what were these objects? We don't know. Just where these objects? They were over the White House and they were over the Capitol. So when you have a radar visual sighting of 8 to 10 UFOs over such a highly restricted airspace, that's going to send a few jet interceptors, and that's exactly what happened. But by the time the interceptors arrived, this is now shortly before dawn, it was too late. These objects were gone. So these sightings made headlines the next day, quite a few headlines. And yet, according to Ruppelt, no one bothered to tell the Air Force, or at least Air Force intelligence, about the sighting, or at least no one bothered to tell Ruppelt's office, which by now is receiving about 30 UFO reports per day. Ruppelt, by the way, was sent to Washington to investigate this. He learned President Truman was personally interested in this, wanted a full investigation. That's good news for Ruppelt, I guess you could say, except that all the while, when he was in Washington, he couldn't even get a military vehicle. He had to use a bus. So who then did Truman want to do a full investigation? Well, clearly not Blue Book. I want to show you a picture of a very key man that Truman was constantly in touch with about this. This is General Robert Landry. Truman was very close to Landry, and Landry served as Truman's Air Force liaison with the CIA on UFOs. I've written about this quite a bit, and Landry, in fact, talked about this toward the end of his life in an oral history interview. Fact was, for 4.5 years, Landry worked with CIA to report to Truman from the summer of 1948 through the end of Truman's presidency. So, and in the summer of 52, Landry was on the phone with Ruppelt, and Ruppelt stated that he knew Truman was listening in on that conversation. So Landry was definitely a big, big part of the picture here. By the way, in between these 2 weekends, this is just a document I want to show you very quickly. Sightings continued fast and furious throughout the eastern U.S. during the whole week in between. And this is just one letter from actually July 29th, but it mentions an encounter from July 25th. It was a classified Air Force letter. And this one particularly describes an encounter on July 25th, late at night, about 11:20 in the evening. You had 2 Air Force F-94s dispatched from Newcastle Air Force Base in Delaware in order to intercept objects which had been seen by radar. One of the F-94s reportedly made visual contact with one of the objects and at first appeared to be gaining on it, but the object and the F-94s were observed on the radar scope and appeared to be traveling at the same approximate speed. However, when it attempted to overtake the object disappeared both from the pursuant aircraft, this is a quote here, and the radar scope. The pilot of the F-94 remarked of the, quote, incredible speed of the object. Just want to point out F-94s were top-of-the-line interceptors by the U.S. Air Force at the time. So this was going on. It wasn't like there was a break in between the 2 weekends. Then on July 26th, UFOs are back over the D.C. area. 8:15 in the evening, you have a pilot and a stewardess of a national airlines flight. They see several objects resembling what one of them described as the glow of a cigarette high above them. Slow-moving lights, maybe 100 miles per hour. It's very slow. Before long, Washington National Airport, again, Andrews Air Force Base, again, are tracking a dozen UFOs throughout most of the sky. They're all going very slowly, 90, 100 miles per hour for an aircraft that's quite slow. Andrews Air Force Base alerts Newcastle Air Force Base around 9 o'clock. And finally, by midnight, 2 F-94s are scrambled to try to intercept these things. Edward Ruppelt was in the control room, the air traffic control room, and talked about how the press was just kicked right out of the air traffic control tower on the grounds that, well, the procedures we're using to intercept are classified. Ruppelt just said this is ridiculous. What Ruppelt actually said here, I have a quote here, I'm just going to show it to you. He said, not a few people in the radar room were positive that this night would be the big night in UFO history, the night when a pilot would close in on and get a good look at a UFO, and they didn't want the press to be in on it. Well, that's right. So the objects were tracked continuously for nearly 2 hours. This is very important because when you get a tracking for that long, it would rule out atmospheric phenomena, at least it would seem to. But as the F-94s approached, these objects that they were pursuing disappeared from the radar. Visibility was outstanding, and still the pilots saw nothing. And as they're returning to their base, the targets returned. And you see this kind of cat and mouse, little toying type of thing happen over and over again in the history of the UFO phenomenon. Not just this weekend in 1952. It happened many, many times. But it happened here. So near Newport News, Virginia, you get reports reaching Langley Air Force Base about odd rotating lights that are giving off different types of colors. Tower operators see these lights. They dispatch another F-94, which gets a radar lock, and the target then speeds away. Back at Washington National Airport, these objects reappeared shortly before dawn. 2 more F-94s are scrambled. The pilots get radar locks again. They're moving toward the targets. Once again, the objects speed away. Eventually, one of the objects seemed to stay put. An F-94 moves in to intercept, and then the object disappears. So that's kind of an amazing thing. Dewey Fournet was a major in the Air Force. He was very closely associated with the Blue Book investigation during this time. He was close with Edward Ruppelt. He was in Washington National Tower all night long. He said everyone in the radar room believed the targets were, quote, very probably caused by solid metallic objects. By the way, next to him there is Al Chop, who was very, very involved in these events as well. He was there. He was a news journalist who was hired by the Air Force to do press releases, work the press for them at that time. One of the F-94 pilots, I just want to mention, his name was William Patterson. He commented, I saw several bright lights. I was at my maximum speed, but even then I had no closing speed. And I'll just add that there was an Air Force intelligence report, which was declassified in the 1980s. It said the entire radar crew was emphatic that the returns were solid, not temperature inversions or any other atmospheric phenomenon. Fournet maintained this. Al Chop also maintained this. So everyone, as a result of this, even the ridiculously hostile, consistently hostile New York Times, reported these Air Force attempts to intercept UFOs. Here's a couple of headlines. At 10 a.m. in the morning on the 27th, Truman is talking to Landry. This is when Landry calls Ruppelt to find out what's going on here. Ruppelt tells Landry, he says, well, you know, maybe weather was causing the targets, but there's no proof. Landry, I have no doubt, was not interested in that explanation at all. And of course, this is where Ruppelt later learned that Truman was listening to the conversation. Across the ocean, incidentally, Winston Churchill, who was Prime Minister of Britain, this is Churchill and Truman earlier in 1952. Churchill wanted to know what was happening, and he writes to his Secretary of State for Air, what does all this stuff about flying saucers amount to? What can it mean? What is the truth? His own staff blew him off with a ridiculously infantile, insipid explanation of UFOs, saying Doesn't seem to be anything. The U.S. government's working on it. No need to get excited about it. So here's the thing. During all this time, all right, there was an uncorroborated claim that the Air Force shot down a UFO during this crisis. And again, this is something that I'll be talking about on my Monday night Richard Dolan show with Frank Vicino. But I just want to mention here that it was well known for many years that the Canadian government official, Wilbur Smith, had talked about this toward the end of his life. Smith died in 1962. He was very well connected to a number of high-ranking U.S. military officials, including Rear Admiral H.B. Knowles of the U.S. Navy. But what Smith said, it was an interview done shortly before he died. A few individuals interviewed him, and he claimed to have shown Admiral Knowles, quote, a piece which has been shot down from a small flying saucer near Washington in July 1952, he said. And there's Smith, and this is part of his quote. He says, I showed it to the Admiral. It was a piece of metal about twice the size of your thumb, which had been loaned to me for a very short time by your Air Force. As a general thing, he said, they differ only in that they are much harder than our materials. It was in reality, he said, a matrix of magnesium orthosilicate. The matrix had great numbers, thousands of 15-micron spheres scattered throughout it. That's fascinating. The interviewer said, well, did you return the piece to the Air Force? And Smith said, not the Air Force, much higher than that. They said, well, was it the CIA? And Smith chuckles, apparently, and he said, I'm sorry, gentlemen, but I don't care to go beyond that point. I can say to you that it went into the hands of a highly classified group. You will have to solve that problem, their identity, for yourselves. So I think that's a true story. And Wilbur Smith, if you've learned anything about him, he was a very meticulous, very dedicated man who was deeply committed to getting into the truth of the UFO phenomenon. So that's his story. Anyway, what happened as a result of these 2 weekends in a row is that the Air Force really had to get out in front of this. And they had a press conference. Famously, it was often been said to have been the largest press conference by the Air Force since the end of World War II. And this happened on July 29th, 1952 at 4 in the afternoon. So it was led by Major General John Samford. He was Director of Air Force Intelligence. And I got a couple more pictures here for you. Let me just show you these. This is Samford here in the center, along with General Roger Ramey, very important person. And here's Edward Ruppelt. Ramey was the man who 5 years earlier had ended all the speculation about the Roswell crash. It's very interesting. So Ramey comes in to consult with Samford on this event as well. I think that's quite significant. Here's Samford. You can find this on YouTube, the actual video. Samford talks about this. So he goes on there. He's relying on the theory put out by astronomer Donald Menzel, is a theory of temperature inversion. Menzel wasn't an atmospheric physicist, but still somehow felt he had the qualifications to give this type of explanation as to false radar returns. Completely invalid explanation. But then he goes on to explain these recent UFO sightings as basically weather phenomenon. He says the atmospheric condition caused the radar beams to bend and pick up objects on the ground. That's temperature inversion. Now, look, Samford wasn't a scientist, and he wouldn't answer many questions, but he had an assistant who was a radar specialist who gave some technical explanations. His name was Captain Roy James. He actually didn't know anything about these incidents. He had just arrived in D.C. that morning. He knew nothing of what was going on. He was just a talking head brought in to give these explanations. Now, there were other people in attendance, but they were not allowed to speak. They were all the air traffic controllers who were in the airports during that time. They were there. They were not allowed to talk to the press. Major Dewey Fernay was there. He wasn't allowed to talk. Al Chop was there. He wasn't allowed. A Lieutenant Holcomb, who was a Navy electronics expert assigned to the Air Force, he was not allowed to talk. All three of them rejected this explanation that Samford gave. Now, here's one thing Samford did say. He said, despite the temperature inversions, this is very smart. He said, there have remained a percentage of this total of all the UFO reports, about 20%, he said, of the reports that have come from credible observers of relatively incredible things. He said, we keep on being concerned about them. Our present course of action is to continue on this problem with the best of our ability, giving it the attention that we feel it definitely warrants. We will give it adequate attention, he said, but not frantic attention. I think that was a smart way to handle it, because the fact was the public was in a very, very high state of attention on this. And I think Samford understood, and Ramey understood, who was advising him, you can't just blow the whole thing off. No one's going to take you seriously. You have to take it somewhat seriously, but you've got to also disable the whole thing as much as possible. And I believe Samford's press conference was actually masterfully done from that point of view. No one in the know believed it, but it was sufficient for the media to accept it and for the general public to accept it as well. So, but really what he was offering was an incredibly weak explanation. And Ruppelt knew it. And Ruppelt just wrote, like, somehow out of this chaotic situation came exactly the result that was intended. The press got off our backs. So that was the temperature inversion explanation. Not really valid. A few people later tried to credit it. The Air Force themselves, Air Force later had a scientific report that discredited the whole explanation, but it didn't get any publicity. So I don't think there were any complaints about how Samford handled this job, because a couple of years later, he became head of an agency known as the NSA. NSA didn't exist in the summer of '52. It was created at the end of 1952, just before Truman's presidency ended. And Samford in 1956, became head of the NSA. So clearly, he was a man who could be relied upon. So here's the thing. The public explanation is always one thing. What the explainers actually believe is another. And what we know, and this is not just from Ruppelt, this is from the classified documents that we have, but we know that several groups in DC were following UFOs very closely. And we have a number of available documents that do support this claim. Let me pull one of them up here. Here we go. So this is a document by the by the FBI, actually, quoting the Air Force Research and Development Board, stating that the Air Force had made very little progress in learning what the phenomena or objects are and what causes them. And this is just a couple of days. This is, in fact, the day of Samford's press conference. So clearly, this is not being believed by people. There was an FBI memo as well from the same day discussing a classified briefing about UFOs from Air Force intelligence, saying the Air Force had failed to arrive at any satisfactory conclusion. Oh, this is it right here. Excuse me. Regarding UFOs, and just noting that reports were being received from all parts of the United States as well as from around the world. And their conclusion was that they were definitely talking about, I don't have the quote in the document here, but I'm just going to read. This is from a Commander Randall Boyd of the Air Intelligence Estimates Division. And Boyd suggested that, quote, the sightings may possibly be from another planet. But at the present time, there's nothing to substantiate this theory, but the possibility is not being overlooked. So the CIA also had some conversations about this. And this is a pretty interesting document describing conversations at the CIA in the immediate aftermath of Samford's press conference. And you just have this one statement. I've typed it out because the print quality is not very good here, but Sightings of UFOs, this is now going back to the Southwest, reported at Los Alamos and Oak Ridge at a time when the background radiation had risen inexplicably. Here we run out of even blue yonder explanations that might be tenable, and we are still left with numbers of incredible reports from credible observers. This is early August 1952. So the Air Force may explain, but that doesn't mean that other people are likely to believe the explanations. I think that's an important thing to point out here. Just to wrap this up, the phenomenon never stopped. All right. While the press was basically being taken off of this, you had sightings throughout August, including many military sightings. In fact, Donald Kehoe was being fed these, and they were being declassified for him by the Blue Book staff, and he was able to write about many of these in his book from early 1953 called Flying Saucers from Outer Space. It really angered some of the top military brass who wondered how the hell did Kehoe get these reports. That policy soon ended. Kehoe was not just simply given all of these declassified UFO reports after that. But it happened that there were many of these throughout August and September of 1952. There was something in the North Sea during an operation called Main Brace, and I want to come back and give an in-depth description of these sightings that were just extraordinary. These were a series of NATO naval exercises during September. And then, of course, the incredible, infamous Flatwoods Monster case of September 1952, an entirely misrepresented, misunderstood event that we'll be talking about with Frank Fascino in a couple of days. So all of this happened all throughout that whole time. Incidentally, Ruppelt continued to give standing-only lectures to the military. So, but you wouldn't know that if you were just reading newspapers. So the primary response to these Washington sightings was that the CIA stepped in and was definitely concerned about two things. One thing that they were concerned about was that this hysteria, this public interest in flying saucers was really getting out of control. And there was talk within the CIA and other military channels that, you know, if the Russians were to do something at this time, we would really be hamstrung because our military communication channels are all being dominated by these UFO reports. Well, that's rather interesting, isn't it? And so the idea is, well, we can't let the UFO reports dominate the channels. That's one thing. But there was definitely a concern within the military and within the CIA as well, that these objects in and of themselves constituted a danger, constituted a threat, and were inexplicable and had to be dealt with. The result of that, the result at least of the fear of public hysteria, was dealt with in the infamous so-called Robertson panel of January 1953. And this was the last act of any significance of the Harry Truman presidency. And the Robertson panel, of course, we've talked about this many, many times. But it was here, I would say, as a direct response to the events of 1952, and particularly the Washington sightings. An attempt successfully was made to take this phenomenon within the classified world and slam that lid down even tighter, so that leaks would not be as easy to have, and where much of the classified world would be removed from investigating this UFO phenomenon. It was, after that, much more restricted, and procedures were put into place that carefully guarded reporting and protocols of dealing with UFOs, particularly something known as JANEP 146 and Air Force Regulation 55 and others were put into place to carefully monitor this so that you couldn't just talk about this to anyone. That's the UFO phenomenon. The classified world, in other words, did get better control over UFO reporting by 1953. And it was the crisis of 1952 that had so much to do with that. So that's a big part of the story of 1952. And I just want to say that this subject matters because it represents something completely anomalous to our standard model of reality. These things aren't supposed to exist. It doesn't fit into our reality, and yet there it is, right? So I'm going to close by asking you, how do we react to this information? Well, I would say that we can only start by recognizing it first, by learning as much as we can about it, by bringing this phenomenon into the public square, so to speak, so that we can talk about it, which is what I'm doing here. But make no mistake, there are powers at work now, just as there were then, to silence these discussions. And not just about UFOs, but everything that they consider to be so-called fake news, misinformation, and so forth. It's really amazing, since our establishment media has been the number one purveyor of fake news and fake reality for our entire lives. They've never been truthful about these things. And they've certainly never been truthful about the things that really matter. And most people, it seems to me, most people have understood this about the establishment media and how they deceptively cover so much of importance. But there's a definite counterattack that the establishment is leading right now. And it's having some success. Make no mistake. They are having some success. And we can't let them win. We must preserve the free space for an open discussion on these matters. And UFOs need to be part of that discussion. The implications are way too profound, and they affect everyone. And if you don't think so, then you haven't been paying attention. Well, I'd like to thank you for being here with me, and I'd like to thank all of you for your support. If you like what you see here, I would encourage you to subscribe to my YouTube channel. It's important to do that as well, because again, we're in a fight for recognition, and people like myself need as many subscribers and followers as I can get. It helps me in dealing with the rest of the world. And if you like what you see, like the video. If you like what you see, subscribe to notifications as well. This way you don't miss a new program when it comes out. All right. Well, I hope this has been useful. I would say never give up on the fight for truth. It's the most important thing we've got. Thanks for listening. Catch you later.